Hello everyone, and welcome to this year Tridge's fifth webinar. I'm Theo and I'm your host today. And we're tackling one of the more complicated topics in agriculture, which is transformations in the agricultural trade in Africa. Now, before we start, we still have a few people entering. We're going to go over some of the technical points just to make a better viewer experience for all of you. So first of all would be the layout. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with online meetings and webinars and so on in recent times, but we suggest you use the side-by-side view mode. So that way you can see both the speakers and you can also see the presentation. Then there's another neat feature on WebEx, which gives you the ability to see captions in different languages. So if you'd like to see some captions, you can click on the little, it looks like a conversation bubble. You can click on that conversation bubble and then just choose the translation option. You can choose one of these languages. So the languages that are available are English, Spanish, French, and German. So you can choose one of these if you would prefer these captions. So that's it from the technical side. I'm gonna show the agenda, but I mentioned this is Tridge's fifth webinar now. And if you're not familiar with the intelligence and solutions team, our division, what we do, we provide qualitative and quantitative data on both food and agriculture. We give tailor-made comprehensive solutions to our clients. We have intelligence about price data, weather data, trade data. We do custom reports. We help our clients make informed decisions. We also provide some solutions like supplier directory, which means on our platform, suppliers and buyers can meet each other and find business opportunities. Now, I hope all of you are already familiar with Tridge, but if you have any questions about Tridge specifically or any questions about some of the technical issues, you can drop them right here on the chat in WebEx. We'll try to get to them as soon as possible. And also, if you have any questions throughout the webinar you would like to ask the panelists or the presenters, you can also drop them in the chat. Now, what I'm going to do with the agenda, I'm going to introduce the presenters at the same time as the agenda. So let me go to the next slides. I'm your host. Like I said, my name is Theo. So I'm a global market analyst, but today, basically my role is to just try and make us all stick to the agenda and go through the webinar as smooth as possible, and also to present the heavy lifters. So let's get to them. I'll try to keep my part as short as possible. So we'll have two presentations. So the first one is going to be by Ben. And I'm just going to ask Ben to quickly introduce himself and also introduce his topic. So Ben, can you just give us a quick introduction, please?
Hi, everyone. I'm Ben Lategan, and I'm a global market analyst at Tridge. And I'll be focusing on trade regulations and trade agreements on the African continent, and some opportunities for trade on the African continent and also off continent.
Fantastic, thank you, Ben. So after Ben's presentation, Bojan will also be giving a presentation. So Bojan, can you give us a quick introduction, please?
Hi everyone, my name is Bojan Mijatovic. I'm a global market analyst at Tridge, specialty fruits and vegetables. My topic for the day will be food and safety regulation, as well as the soil and crop management of fruits and vegetables in Africa.
Thank you, Bojan. So after Bojan's presentation, we're going to go to the panel discussion, which is point number 3 here. The panel discussion will be done by Charl and by Mevis. Now, I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves when we get to the panel discussion, because it's still a while off. But Charl is our global logistics specialist, and then Mevis is our senior engagement manager. So they'll be doing the panel discussion, and when the panel discussion is finished, we'll do some questions and answers from our viewers. Now, these questions and answers will go to our presenters and our panelists. So when we get to point 4, we'll discuss that further. So I like to keep my part short, so I think we're just going to kick off with the presentations. So that means we're going to go over to you, please, Ben.
Sure. Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'll be discussing trade agreements in Africa and their influence on agriculture on the continent. We'll first have a brief look at what existing trade agreements there are. Then we'll have a look at the African Continental Free Trade Area. And then we'll look at specific trade agreements and more specifically opportunities at five key countries for agriculture on the continent, which is Nigeria, South Africa, Egypt, Morocco, and Kenya. So if we look at the first slide, the existing trade agreements on the continent, we have in the south, we have the South African Development Community, and we have the Southern African Customs Union. If we move a bit more to the middle of the country, or the continent, then we have ECAS, which is the Economic Community of Central African States, and we also have ECOWAS, which is the Economic Community of West African States. And then we also have COMESA, which focuses here on the middle and more towards the north, which is the Common Market for Eastern and the Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa. And we also have the EAC, which is the East African Community. So the existing trade agreements on the continent is quite fragmented. It's just portions of countries everywhere, and that led to the introduction, or the AU, or the African Union, was coming up with the African Continental Free Trade Area, which is a very ambitious trade pact, which would form the world's largest trade area by connecting about 1.3 billion people, bringing 54 African countries together with a combined GDP of about $3.4 trillion. Currently, 54 of the 55 states have signed the agreement, and 43 states have ratified or deposited the instruments of ratification with the African Union. Trade officially commenced on 1 January 2021, but since then no trade has taken place. Theo, can we move to the second slide, please? Sorry. Now, negotiations are underway to eliminate 90% of tariffs over a 5-year period, or 90% of tariffs, yes, over a 5-year period, with an additional 7% of tariffs eliminated over a further 10-year period. Now, the World Bank did a study on this African Free Trade Area and this agreement, and it estimates that by 2035, real income gains of full implementation of this free trade area would amount to about $450 billion. And the volume of total export would increase by 29% relative to business as usual, with intracontinental exports increasing 81%, while business off the continent would rise by about 19%. And if full implementation can be achieved, it would help lift about 30 million people out of poverty, extreme poverty, and a further 68 million out of moderate poverty. Let's have a look at this next slide and focus a bit on the agricultural side and what this agreement would mean for agriculture on the continent. Now, this free trade area would significantly boost African agricultural trade by about 50%, 49% the World Bank estimated by 2035 for intra-Africa trade, and 10% for agricultural trade off-continent. Now, agricultural output would contract by about 0.5%, or $8 billion, compared to just business as usual. But this is because the African continent would focus, or certain countries on the African continent would focus less on agriculture and more on manufacturing, especially in North Africa. It would mean greater agricultural output for about 15 of the 24 countries that were part of this study. Now, agriculture is growing faster in all parts of Africa, like I said, except in North Africa, which is focusing more on manufacturing and moving more towards manufacturing and services. And 60% of African countries would see growth in the value of their output of agricultural goods. And if we look at barriers to trade on the African continent, there's tariff barriers and then there's non-tariff barriers. Now, intra-Africa trade-weighted tariffs for agriculture are expected to decline from about 5% to 2% by 2035. And if we move to the next slide, and also intra-Africa trade-weighted non-tariff barriers would decrease from 30% to 16.5%. So we're seeing a decrease well, for full implementation of this agreement, we'll see a decrease in tariffs as well as non-tariff trade barriers between countries. Now, non-tariff barrier reduction is expected to reduce agricultural import costs by about 17% from non-African countries. And African exports to non-African countries are expected to decrease by 20%. Now, the agricultural import price or the import price of agricultural goods on the continent would decrease about 28% in total. And the agricultural employment would increase in about 16% of the countries involved, and wages for unskilled and skilled labor would grow faster where there is an expansion in agricultural employment. But employment is expected to decline on the continent from about 36% to roughly 30%, with only about 300,000 net jobs created. So it looks to be that trade would increase, output would increase, and trade barriers would decrease. But we're not seeing a massive impact on employment in agriculture. And the reason for this is that a lot of economies are shifting, not a lot of economies, but some economies are shifting away from agriculture, and as mechanization also becomes more prevalent in agriculture. So yeah, it seems to have a very positive, full implementation would have a very positive impact on agricultural trade on the African continent. Let's have a look at the specific countries, focusing on Nigeria first, and the trade agreements that Nigeria has. So Nigeria have quite a few trade agreements with countries in North Africa, especially in South America. But where opportunities still exist for Nigeria. Nigeria has quite a few not untapped markets, but countries where it does not have trade agreements, where quite a bit of trade takes place. And that is specifically China and Japan, and especially the US. Now, Nigeria exports mostly cacao, sesame seeds, and cashew nuts, among others. But it can definitely benefit from trade agreements with these countries. And if you note on that map, it also doesn't have any free trade agreement with the EU, although that is in process and under negotiation at the moment. So currently focusing on that EU trade agreement, getting that in place, and then it can look at developing trade agreements between China, Japan, and the US. Currently, there's very little there, with great opportunities. If we move on to South Africa, now South Africa has, as part of SADC and its SACU agreement, quite a bit of free trade agreements in Southern Africa, and with Mercosur it has free trade, and then in Europe it has free trade agreements. Now the majority of South Africa's fresh produce or agricultural commodities is value-added fruits, which is citrus and grapes are the main stuff, and then wine as well as exported. It focuses mainly on the EU and the UK especially, but there's definitely opportunities in China, in India, in Russia, and then also in the Middle East for enhanced trade agreements or better trade agreements, and just reduction in tariffs, better trade deals, trade agreements with these countries would definitely be beneficial for trade in Africa. Something that South Africa also suffers a bit from is port congestion. Currently, we've picked up that we're looking at about 8 days of port congestion at the port of Cape Town. And with the recent flooding in KZN, the port's back up and running, but access to that port is still a bit is still not ideal. So we still have some inefficiencies there. A great trade agreement, or great trade agreement that is in process at the moment, is between South Africa and India. If we move on to the next slide, we can have a look at Morocco. Now Morocco is quite well connected in North Africa. In the EU, we have the whole of South America. They have pretty much connections with. And they also have a trade agreement that a few African countries have with the US. So, and there's also a lot of free trade agreements or trade deals in process with Morocco. It started with Canada and definitely some West African states. It's joined ECOWAS. It started. It's also in where Morocco has very few trade agreements or trade relationships, is moving south into Africa, but that's not where its main markets lie. So if you look at the exports of Morocco, we're looking at tomatoes, we're looking at berries, and we're looking at citrus. Mainly goes to the EU and also a bit to Russia, Canada, US. So Morocco is quite well covered with its existing free trade agreements and with free trade agreements or trade agreements that it has in process. There's not a lot of opportunities or a lot of areas of Morocco that need work. Russia and Japan are definitely countries to focus on to build better relations with. And if we're looking at Morocco, there's very little port congestion at the moment, so that's not an issue at all. Let's have a look at Egypt real quick. Egypt also very well connected with regards to trade agreements in Africa, in South America. It's well connected in Europe, as well as over large parts of Asia. So, and this is with trade agreements, with trade blocks, as well as just bilateral trade agreements with singular countries. And in process is also, so Egypt is also very well covered with regards to its trade agreements. Egypt is also in process with the Egypt and the Eurasian Economic Union are negotiating a trade agreement. So that would mean that that would give Egypt access to, or free trade access to Russia, which would be great. So Egypt exports citrus, grapes, berries, and that leaves the only major market for Egypt that's not really covered by a free trade agreement to be China, if that trade agreement comes off. So Egypt also very well covered with regards to trade agreements, and it's So if we have a look at the last one, let's have a look at Kenya quickly. Kenya is the one that they have very little. There's very little trade agreements that Kenya has with the rest of the world. They have a little bit in Africa through EAC and COMESA. And off continent, they have a free trade agreement with the UK, but that leaves the entire North America, South America is untapped. We have nothing with Europe there, and we have very little connection in Asia. So I mean, you have Pakistan is untapped there, and the whole of EU is untapped. If you look at the exports, tea and coffee and cut flowers is the main agricultural commodities that are exported from Kenya. And big markets are for cut flowers. It's the Netherlands and the UK and Germany. So Netherlands and Germany is uncovered there. For coffee, it's Belgium, US, and Germany. All markets are not covered by free trade agreements. So on the Kenyan side, there's still quite a bit of work left to do with regards to negotiating trade agreements and becoming part of greater trade. Just negotiating trade agreements and more favorable trade tariffs and trade regulations with countries. So Kenya has quite a bit of work to do with regards to trade agreements. One positive thing about Kenya is it's with current container prices and port congestion, it's not experiencing a massive port congestion. We only have about 4 days of port congestion that we're noticing there. So at least it's getting, especially its fresh produce to market quite quickly. Yeah, and that's just a brief look at the trade agreements that is existing on the African continent, the African Free Trade Area, and then having a look at the individual countries. So in general, most countries that we have had a look at are well covered with regards to trade agreements within major trading partners, but there's definitely some negotiation that's still left to be done with each of those countries with major markets that are still untapped. And Kenya is a great example of where there's still a lot of work to do with free trade agreements and better trade regulations and agreements with world partners and their trading partners. I'm going to hand over to the next presenter, Bojan.
Thank you, Ben. Hi, everyone. My topic will be food and safety regulations and soil crop management for citrus fruit in Africa. Next slide. Theo, please. What is common to all food and safety regulation is the responsibility for ensuring that domestic and imported food products are safe, sanitary, nutritious, wholesome, and properly labeled. National legal frameworks are a key pillar in an effective food control system. In all countries, food is governed by a complexity of laws and regulations, which set out the government's requirements to be met by food chain operation to ensure food safety and quality. Of course, food and safety regulations cannot be taken into account without trade agreements and trade measures. Food safety and certifications have become leading aspects in the fresh produce trade, and social standards and certifications are added for better information that bring the transparency. The goal is to reduce technical barriers and enhance market openness. Next slide, please, Theo. Regarding the Africa-US regulations, although US markets present massive economic opportunities, these markets can also be challenging to enter and navigate. For example, businesses seeking to export to the United States must meet high standards for product quality, comply with regulatory requirements, supply US buyers and commercial volumes of reliable timelines, and meet consumer expectations. On this graph, you can see that 24 African countries are eligible for fruit imports, 15 eligible African countries for vegetable imports. Regarding the countries for fruit imports, South Africa, Morocco, and Tunisia dominate and had the highest number of eligible commodities. For vegetable imports, Egypt, Nigeria, Kenya, and Morocco had the most eligible commodities. Most fruit commodities are eligible than vegetables. North Africa, for example, has more market access than others in terms of extensive margin of export. Next slide, Theo, please. These are the US market access conditions. US market access conditions for food import control system regarding federal and food safety requirements. Almost total 22 requirements are from US market, chemical and veterinary drugs, among them pesticide residue regulations and others. Regarding the applicable treatment requirements for fruits and vegetables import to the United States, there are a total 9 technical measures, among them cold treatment, then fumigation, and quick freeze. Regarding the non-technical measures, ports allowed, permitted import, phytosanitary requirements, etc. Big difference between the EU and the US is more agencies in EU, in United States are regulating the same thing. For example, EFIS, FDA, EPA, and others all concentrated on aquaculture, while in EU it's all regulated by one body. Moving on to the next slide. EU, Africa, EU, to avoid health and environmental risks, the European Union has set maximum residual levels, MRLs, for pesticides in and on food products. Products that are containing more pesticide than allowed will be withdrawn from the European market. Regulation 2021-2285 regards the listing of pests, prohibitions, and requirements for the introduction into and the movement within the EU for plant products, plants, and other objects. Regulation 396-2005 and its amendments regulates MRLs of pesticides. According to the European RSFF border rejections, the main reason for EU border rejections of fruits and vegetables from African countries were the presence of mycotoxins and pesticide residues and the poor or insufficient control. Conclusion on the EU trade food safety agreements. African countries must invest in infrastructure and technical and storage capacities. These investments may help to reduce the cost of complying with quality and safety standards, but it's necessary cost. Efforts must also be made to improve African exporters' access to mutual certification bodies for edible, vegetable, and fruits. There is also need to harmonize the EU quality and safety standards in accordance to Codex Alimentarius. Rejections rates do vary by country. Leading fruit exporters, Cameroon, Cote d'Ivoire, and South Africa all have relatively low rejection rates compared with the major developing country supplies as well. Next slide, please. Africa and China. China has enforced new rules on import and export food safety from January 1st, 2022. The new rules provide more details on customs authority requirements on overseas food safety assessments. The GAC Decree number 249 presents the following major changes. Emphasizes that producers and operators are accountable for the safety of the food products they produce and handle. This also introduced the concept of conformity assessment, which covers the evaluation of foreign food safety management system. Register food importers to establish a system for review of their suppliers, including overseas exporters and production facilities. Also, we must emphasize on China's Belt and Road Initiative in Africa. From November 2021, on a forum, China was obliged to expand the import of quality specialty agri-food products from Africa and open so-called green lanes for African agricultural exports to China. To speed up inspection and quarantine procedures, build a China-Africa incubation center to support African countries in areas such as animal and plant quarantine, import and export of food safety, and frontier health quarantine. This is all on agreed, but current conditions said that stringent requirements in terms of rules of origin and sanitary and phytosanitary measures hinder trade. Next slide, please. Yeah. Soil crop management can increase productivity and yields of fruit vegetables in Africa. Regarding the citrus fruit can successfully be grown in wide range of soil types. These soil types must be well drained, fertile, with pH between 6 and 6.5, ideally. Also, water requirements depends on the weather conditions. Saturated and poorly drained conditions could result in root rot. Moisture stress during the early spring while the tree is flowering could result in excessive drop of flowers and fruitlets. Major pests and diseases, I'll focus on two parts. You have all the pests and diseases on slide, but for the pest, the false codling moth is a pest of citrus and other crops in sub-Saharan Africa. As it is endemic to this region and as South Africa export most of this citrus around the world, for EU, there is a zero tolerance for any infestation with live larvae in the market. Consequently, control measures prior to exporting must be high. Another problem is a fungi disease, citrus black spot. In the EU, additional measures must be implemented to successfully ensure that the fruits are accompanied by a traceability code, which allows tracing back whenever necessary if the detection of the pest occur all the way down to the production site. Exporters must also guarantee that the fruit is being produced under strict phytosanitary treatments and that they originate from production sites where the specified pest was not detected. How can we fight against this? Good agricultural practice, resistant varieties, regular monitoring, early detection, biodiversity, natural pesticide, and conventional pesticide are some of the measures that can provide a lower risk of these diseases and pests occur. Next slide, please, Theo. Regarding the soil fertility in sub-Saharan Africa, only 6% of cultivated land is irrigated in Africa, compared with 37% in Asia, for example. Africa also has the largest share of uncultivated land with rain-fed crop potential in the world. In addition, African farmers use substantially less fertilizer per hectare than their counterparts in East Asia and Pacific. On the maps, you can see that some soils are physically and chemically constrained, with 30% having low nutrient content and about 70% having high soil pH. Almost 55% of African land is desert and can only support nomadic grazing. Overgrazing, deforestation, and overcultivation without efficient nutrient management leave soil nutrient loss in sub-Saharan Africa. Some African soils lack essential nutrients. In Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania, low yield of crops was attributed mainly to poor soil fertility. For instance, zinc is deficient in most West African soils. Feral soils, which have low capacities to supply essential nutrients to crops, occupy a sizable part of Central Africa in countries such as Angola, Zambia, Burundi, Uganda, and Cameroon. Low fertile soil mostly characterize West African countries such as Liberia and Sierra Leone and part of Madagascar. The soil lacks calcium, magnesium, and potassium, and acidic has a high level of free magnesium, which is toxic to crops. Also, some South African soils are deficient in potassium and phosphorus, making them unsuitable for cultivation. Next slide. How can we improve soil health? The importance of good agriculture practice in the production, covering the soil surface to protect it through the year, cover cropping, encouraging the use of organic inputs combined with mineral fertilizers. Efficiency of mineral fertilizers increase with combined with organic inputs such as manures, compost, mulches, and cover crops. Increase irrigation to fight drought-related shocks and stresses. Invest in infrastructure to proper management of public irrigation schemes. Of course, it is important to ensure irrigation is managed in a way that avoid negative consequences of waterlogging and salinization. Crop rotation. Crop rotation is a necessary means to fight pests and diseases and also to improve soil nutrients. Enables farmers to maintain land under continuous cultivation by planting with one crop after another in successive seasons. This practice also helps farmers to seasonal market demands for certain crops. It reduces the quantity of pests and diseases on the field. Good example is the management of the soil-borne bacterium Ralstonia solanacearum that causes wilt disease in crops belonging to Solanaceae family. This includes sweet and hot peppers, eggplant, tomato, nightshade, tree tomato, as well as potatoes and tobacco. We can move to the next slide, Theo, please. Plant health. How crop protection can affect the yield of fruits and vegetables in Africa. We can use resistant varieties, use trap crops and pheromone traps, biological control agents, and the reasonable use of chemical pesticides. Of course, monitoring and surveillance, regular tracking of the field conditions and pests and diseases are of most importance. Recognizing symptoms linked to the pests and diseases and differentiating the pests and diseases from those caused by physical stress such as nutrient deficiency, drought, flooding, heat, sun, cold, and salinity. Of course, I must emphasize the importance of the advisory service, public and private extension agencies, as well as digital tools such as there are a lot of startups in Africa that provide services of the monitoring of fields and pests. Whenever they are available, fruits and vegetable varieties with known resistance against common pests should be used. Chemical control. Danger of using wrong chemicals, pesticides, a combination of incompatible chemicals, doses, timing, types of application, incorrect storage, and disposal can lead to pesticide poisoning. This also have environmental issues. Using wrong usage of pesticides may affect beneficial organisms like bees. Pesticide residues above accepted levels, maximum residue levels, MRLs, prohibit trade, and therefore directly lead to food loss, or if consumed, to consumers being exposed to increased level of pesticide residues. Locust farms have been very damaged in the past. In 2021, significant outbreaks have been reported in Namibia, Botswana, and Karoo area of South Africa. In conclusion, agricultural technologies such as drip irrigation, plant-based fertilizers, crop rotation, and integrated pest management all increase the resilience of a farmer, especially in the face of climate change, and thus contributing to improved production. However, these strategies all require financial capital. Obtaining the capital without the necessary financial literacy is a major obstacle for smallholder farmers, as banks will not invest in farmers who provide little assurance to yield returns. Thank you, Theo. That will be all from my side.
Fantastic. Thank you, both Ben and Bojan. I think we all know the potential in Africa is massive, but there's some management improvements that needs to be done. Now we're going to go next to the panel discussion, which will be a discussion by Charl and Mevis. Now, I'm just going to ask them to quickly introduce themselves. So, Charl is our global logistics specialist. So, Charl, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what does it mean to be a global logistics specialist and what activities are you involved in? See if we can find Charl.
Here we go. Sorry about that. Thank you for the introduction, Theo. My name is Charl Lingenfelder. I'm a global logistics specialist with Tridge. I've been in logistics, transport, and operations for the best part of 9 years now. And it's become a hobby, it's become a passion. And I'm involved with getting containers loaded, getting containers on board vessels, arranging documentation to be done, and ensuring that the cargo arrives at destination on time in as high as possible quality as it possibly can, and then dealing with any and all logistics matters in between.
Thank you very much, Charl. And Mevis, I'm going to ask you the same question. So what does it mean to be a senior engagement manager, and what are some of your activities that you are involved in?
Hi everyone. Thank you, Theo. My name is Mevis Aiyeju. I'm Senior Engagement Manager with Tridge. It basically involves the supply chain in terms of supply, so supply of commodities, supply of goods, especially from Nigeria. So I'm doing this from Nigeria, but I'm also providing support in some of the other countries in the West African region. And then at times we also deal with buyers, predominantly Tridge engaged in Africa for the sourcing of commodities, and I provide all the support and sourcing, finding, and then as well as logistics to get the goods to the destination.
Thank you very much, Mevis. So we're going to move on to this panel discussion. I'd just like to remind everybody that you can leave some questions in the chat if you have any questions to our presenters, also to our panelists. We'll try to get to most of them. So go ahead and use the chat feature. The panel discussion will work like this. We'll start with a question, which I'm going to ask. The first question I'm going to ask Charl first. Charl will answer this question, and then Mevis will also have a discussion and add some points to that. So let's go to the first question, one of the tougher ones. So Charl, if you can answer, what are the main challenges and barriers facing the agricultural trade industry in Africa?
Theo, I think from personal experience, one of the biggest challenges we face, not only in South Africa, but in the export industry as a whole, is the general lack of reef equipment or reef containers, as well as the space availability on cargo vessels. Now, shipping lines have had to resort to repurposing discontinued reef containers, and as much as it is a viable option, it's a time-consuming process. And I mean, the first thought that comes to mind, I was guilty of this as well, when you hear repurposed or discontinued reef container, is that they're not of the best quality or suitable for cargo exports. Now, this is in fact, it's not the case. These containers are repaired by highly skilled technicians across the country, and then they are thoroughly cleaned and inspected by our National Control Board, which we know as PPCB. Now, with the demand for South African citrus growing exponentially every year, shipping lines have been unable to keep up with the growing demand. Empty containers have been brought into local ports on inbound voyages, but they can't get turned around fast enough for these containers to be converted to export reefers again. Now, this results in big delays in transshipment ports, and it also affects the transport times to our various export markets, various export ports. And that is, I think, one of the biggest concerns. But the one that's out of our control would be our South African weather. As Ben mentioned earlier, with the floods in KZN and Mpumalanga, it brought the Durban port to a standstill. Now that resulted in people having to divert cargo to alternate ports at additional costs, and major delays, road closures, and not only weather but high winds, with PE being known as the Windy City, Cape Town being known for high winds from October right through to February, even as far as middle March. It brings ports to a complete standstill. So operations they grind to a halt. And this is even after farms and exporters have been directly influenced by weather as well. The flooding of local farms, damage to fruit, delay in packing. The weather is completely out of our control, but it's one of our biggest challenges we face year in and year out.
Thank you, Charl. Mevis, can you add to that? In your opinion, what are some of the main challenges in agriculture in Africa?
Yes. I mean, I'm looking more at where everything starts from, which is production. That's for me is a major challenge, and I think that's across Africa. Because I mean, so I know in West Africa, production, about 90% of production comes from smallholder farmers. I'm sure if we average that out for the entire continent, it will be a bit less than that. It won't be that high, but definitely more than 50% of agriculture or commodity production comes from smallholder farmers across Africa. And unfortunately, in a lot of these regions, smallholder farmers are very limited in resources and knowledge and training, financial resources, good agricultural practices, as the previous presenter was referring to. So there are challenges in terms of the volume, the quality of production, post-harvest practices. There are challenges in terms of quality control. So even regarding the presentation around some of the trade agreements, I feel like there are a lot of barriers beyond the trade agreements where smallholder farmers will not be able to reap the benefits simply because they don't meet the standards to actually take advantage or reap the benefits of such trade agreements, right? So they lack standardization. A lot of the goods are being rejected when they arrive in certain countries, right? When they arrive in Europe or in the US because they're not meeting certain standards. I mean, and the trade agreements are great, and policies to support that are also great, but I think there's also a lack of implementation at the grassroots level where, how are you really seeing how these policies are being implemented? The AFCFTA was signed a while ago, and right now there are no real ways to take advantage of that when it comes to cross-border trading within Africa, like currencies, things like that. How do you trade without having to change currencies 3 times and lose financing on that? So in summary, I would say production, the production quality and volume of smallholder farmers, and then everything in between to kind of support that and create an enabling environment for it.
Thank you very, very much, Mevis. I'm going to ask you one more question on that. So if smallholder farmers need to improve the quality, how do you think, or in your opinion, what's the best way to do that? Is it through investment, training? How do you think they can improve the quality that they provide?
So, I mean, that's the million-dollar question. It's a bit complicated. And I think it's a combination of things. I was actually part of a skills gap analysis that was done. It was specific to cashew, but I think a lot of that data can actually kind of cut across from smallholder farmers. There are skills that lack, but then there are also resources they lack, right? So there are a lot of training and initiatives actually being done by a lot of development agencies across the continent and all that. But I think the training alone is not enough. I think at the end of the day, after the training, the smallholder farmers then require the tools to be able to implement what they've learned, right? So if you're training a smallholder farmer on, good agricultural practice, on how to apply pesticides properly, but later he doesn't have the financial resources to buy, the pesticide, it's almost a little bit redundant, right? So it's almost a bit of a chicken and the egg. It will probably have to be like a hybrid, right, where you're training, but then also creating systems, right, that will then allow farmers to take advantage of what they've learned, right? And we can then over time see an improved output, whether it's through volume or quality. So yeah, of course, I mean, there's no 100% straightforward answer to this, but I think it's definitely a combination of, improving on skills and the knowledge that farmers have, but then also providing resources, whether it's through financial institutions or whatever it is, to improve, and for them to be able to apply and make a change on the continent.
Thanks very much, Mevis. All right, we're going to go to the next question. This question is, what are the main innovators in solutions that have been implemented to address these challenges? So what is being done at the moment? And I'm going to start with you this time, Mevis, so can
Sorry, you were gone for a second, so I didn't hear you very well.
So Mevis, yeah, I just want you to answer. So at the moment, what are some of the innovations and solutions that are currently already being implemented to solve these challenges?
So, I mean, I think obviously the first thing I am going to say will be technology, as cliche as it is. But I think technology is being applied as a tool across the continent in many, many different ways. So I think in logistics, it's being applied a lot more, and also to facilitate trade, right? So Tridge, these are the kind of tools that, were not accessible maybe before on the continent. And I think they're very useful simply because of infrastructure that lacks in a lot of places, right? So you can use kind of technology to bridge communication. At the same time, obviously, is significant investment. Obviously it varies by regions and it varies by countries where the investment is going. But I think globally, generally, everybody agrees that investment needs to go into agriculture, and Africa is obviously at the top of the list simply because of the enabling environment from an soil and climate perspective, right? So there is a lot of focus in it. I think if we compare to, 20 years ago, it's definitely a lot more significant than what it was. Also, when you're looking at conflict in other regions outside of Africa, right, it's kind of pushing more for production within Africa. So I think from a technology perspective, there's a lot of investment. As the previous presenter also spoke about, there's a lot of investment into startups who are creating little solutions around agriculture, access to market for smallholder farmers, logistics, simplifying logistics, digitizing logistics. So there is definitely a lot of investment, a lot of activity. And I'm sure if it is measured over the past 20 years, there would definitely be a difference in what it is now and what it was back then. I just think, obviously, a lot more needs to happen. There's no two ways around that. But yeah, I think around technology and development, there's a lot of investment going on.
Thanks, Mevis. So, Charl, the same question. Now, you mentioned the weather is the biggest problem. How do we solve the weather? What are some innovations and solutions we can at least use to mitigate some of the challenges?
It's that's quite the challenge we face. We've gone to the stage where we start planning around. You kind of watch the weather. You watch wind reports. You've got very useful tips online for example, wind guru. If you see your wind is predicted at very high speeds for the next day, you kind of start negotiating with shipping lines and with your exporters and your farmers to kind of plan container loads in between high gust days or high wind days. Because with the port being closed, you'd essentially have to load a container and then let it stand or have it plugged in at a depot until the wind calms down. And so I think a lot of planning goes into working around the weather, where you'd where you essentially load your container a day before high winds or a day after high winds. It's a tricky challenge, and unfortunately, we've not managed to, other than proper planning, we've not managed to negotiate around flooding or high winds or hail, even through drought. I think with flooding, the only improvement that can be done there is infrastructure improvement at least. Making your roads, your ports, as far as possible, reinforcing to try and combat around that. But it's a very tricky situation to work around.
Thank you, Charl. Yeah, not an easy solution, I can imagine. So thank you very much, Mevis and Charl, for your inputs. We're going to go to the Q&A session. So the Q&A, these are questions from our viewers that they asked. And this will be to our presenters as well as our panelists. The first question that we received from one of our viewers, I'm going to ask Ben and also Charl to give your inputs on this. So the question is, what are the current shipping rates to export mainly to the EU and Asia? And what are the expectations for flight rates? So Ben, I'm going to ask you first to answer this question.
Sure, Charl. Sorry, Theo. All right. So, if we look at the global consumer index, the Freightos Global Consumer Index, it reached a massive peak of over $11,000 in September last year, and it's slowly been coming down, and we're currently at about 8,236 was the last one I checked. That's just the global consumer index, so that's just a lot of different shipping rates, an index of a lot of different shipping rates. But that's massively higher than the 1,200, 1,500 mark we saw before the pandemic and before the Russia-Ukraine war. It's definitely on a downward trend. We're definitely looking at a downward trend on global shipping rate. It looks like it's coming down. I don't know when or if we will reach pre-pandemic shipping rates. I think Charl can chip in a bit there. Last shipping rates, I just checked South African shipping rates. Like if you're going from Cape Town to Rotterdam, that's $7,400. Durban to Shanghai is $5,600. There's lots of different ports to in Africa and in Europe. But if we're just looking at South Africa, that's sort of the rates that they were going in May. So we reached massive peaks at the end of last year, and I think we're going on a downward trend. But I don't think we'll reach pre-pandemic levels anytime soon. And I think the global container crisis is going to continue at least for the remainder of this year. Charl, over to you.
Thank you, Ben. Yes, I definitely agree on that point. The global container crisis has impacted freight rates so immensely that I don't see it coming down. We are seeing a bit of a downward trend, but it's been fluctuating so much over the last couple of weeks. You see, from a shipping line point of view, that they are adjusting their export rates and their freight rates almost every 3 to 4 weeks now. And I spoke to my team, it was on Tuesday, is that we might see an increase in freight rates out of South Africa in the next month or so by as much as $700 to $1,000. So while we do get, it's like the petrol price in South Africa. One day you get a bit of luck and the price comes down, but a month or two down the line, it's got a knock-on effect again, and it skyrockets. But we are hoping that by the end of this year it stabilizes. I don't think it's going to be pre-pandemic costs again, but hopefully we can get close to that again once the container crisis has stabilized.
Thanks very much, Ben and Charl. We're going to go to the next question. The next question will be about investments currently in Africa. I'm going to ask Mevis about this one. So what are some of the investments that's being done in Africa right now, and how do you think it will change production and supply?
Okay. Yes. So I think on the investment end, what's actually happening is that it's being driven a lot by multilateral financial institutions. So you have organizations like Bank and Co who are investing heavily in other African countries, either through logistics, so infrastructure around logistics, like dry ports and things like that. There's also a lot of financing and loans that they're making available to people in production or in agriculture or in trade. So they, for example, would finance trade hubs and things like that. So I think investments are going both through the African Development Bank, Bank, major financial institutions, and then obviously they then utilize smaller financial institutions or even venture capitalists or firms within the countries, like industry banks who provide loans to farmers. So there's actually a lot of financing going into agriculture, and it's being pushed predominantly through like multilateral financial institutions, and then kind of trickle down to those either through banks and whatnot.
And do you think a lot of these investments make a big difference at grassroots level, or does it trickle down all the way?
I mean, I think again it's a little bit difficult to measure, but I think it's difficult to measure in a smaller amount of time. I think if we look at maybe 20 years ago and we compare it, then we can see a difference, right? Where there's a lot more attention. Of course, I'll use Nigeria as an example. A lot of the banks were not willing to do agricultural loans, right? Just because it's so risky and it's very hard to mitigate that risk. But a lot of the banks have started now providing loans to farmers, for example, to smallholder farmers, right? Because these major financial institutions are pushing them to do that, right? So of course, we can't say a few billion people have benefited from it, but we're definitely able to say that these little drops, they're going to make a difference in the next, 10, 20, 30 years. So I definitely think there is a difference. Obviously, we may not be able to say it's very tangible in output yet, but there's definitely a change, 100%. Even if you just look at the change of the age of the average farmer in Africa, it used to be like 60 something and it's starting to come down because the youth and younger people are getting a lot more involved. So I think that's also an indication that there's kind of a change and transformation in that sector. So of course, we're not going to see something change drastically in 10 years. It's going to take a long time, but there's definitely a lot of activities and there is a little bit of change in that for sure.
Thank you very much, Mevis. Next question I'm gonna direct to Charl, and also maybe Bojan, you can tell us. So the requirements, what are some of the requirements needed to export fruits? So that would be from Africa. So Charl, can you tell us, and then Bojan, if you could add a little bit for these fruits to enter, especially like the EU market, what are some of the requirements? So Charl, can you tell us, please?
Sure, Theo. Your basis would be to get all your registrations done on the South African side. That's being registered as an exporter with customs or with SARS. You would also then have to be approved and registered as a food business operator in order to obtain an FBO code. You'll need approval from PPCB and Department of Agriculture, which would include PUC codes, packhouse codes to be registered from all your suppliers from your farms. You'll need FMS approval for citrus exports. That is being registered with FICLEAN, especially for the more strict markets like the EU. And then also your pallets need to be, that's called the IPPC requirement, that your pallets are only valid to be used for 12 months. And they also need to be treated and made in a specific way, which also is a requirement not only by our local control board, but by our destination boards as well. And then you'll have your special requirements for special markets to your Far East, with the likes of cold treatment, fumigation, and permits. Your export permits and import permits required for your special markets. Bojan, if you can add something to that, please.
Yes, thank you, Charl. Regarding of the EU import basically, as I said in presentation, depends of the products. For citrus fruits, quarantine pests and quarantine diseases, it must be proved that there are none in the areas of the fruits produced. And of course, the MRLs for the pesticides must be on EU levels of agreement. So these are the main points. Aside of the documentation, needs to be proved the traceability of the products, where it came from. The documentation must prove the whole process of the food from farm to the trader to the exporting point. So that's the key points. So the MRLs, quarantine pests and diseases, and the traceability of the product.
Thanks, Charl. So I think we have time for one more quick question, which is quite a tough one. Bojan, I'm also going to ask you this one. So the question is, how can we increase food sustainability in Africa? And how will it contribute to the global food supply, especially now during COVID and the Russia-Ukraine crisis?
That's a very difficult question, Theo. So food sustainability cannot happen overnight. It must be government related and regulated. And of course, the trade is important. Keep the trade flowing and minimize disruption to supply chains. Encourage the diversification of agricultural imports. Encourage the diversification of agricultural production in domestic countries. Ensure an affordable supply of fertilizers. For example, Kenya is 70% related to between 2021 to 22 of import of fertilizer from Russia. So always there will be some crises affecting the production, agricultural production. So diversification is the key.
Fantastic. Thank you, Bojan. Okay, everybody, that brings us to the end of this webinar. I'd like to thank our presenters and also our panelists for the profound inputs. You will be receiving, all of you that joined us today and registered for the webinar, you will be receiving a follow-up email. I think it will be out in 48 hours. So any more questions that were asked during the webinar on the chat, we'll try to answer them in this follow-up email. Also, if you have any questions, here are our contact details. So for the sales team, Global Enterprise Sales at Tridge.com, and for the Intelligence and Solution team, Intelligence Solutions at Tridge.com. This webinar will also be, the recording will be sent in the follow-up email, and it should also be available on social media, YouTube. So if you'd like to review or if you'd like to see the contact information or anything like that, it will be available. So once again, thanks to our presenters and our panelists, and thanks to everybody that joined us today. And have a good day wherever you are.